Today I'm down in Southern California taking a look at the new Subaru Outback Wilderness. This is not just the most off-road capable Subaru on sale in the United States, it's the start of a new sub-brand for Subaru, so expect other Wilderness models to come very shortly. At the moment we don't know what Subaru models will be next for the Wilderness treatment, but you can logically expect the Forester, perhaps the Crosstrek to get it at some point in time. This model combines the turbocharged engine that we find in the top-end versions of the Outback with increased ground clearance up to 9.5 inches in this model. That's about a 1-inch increase over the regular Outback. It also has a standard skid plate up front, which is a little bit different than the normal one, and then optional skid plates throughout the underbody of the vehicle. Those would be installed by your dealer, or you could install them yourself aftermarket. Subaru then borrowed some drivetrain components from the larger 3-row Ascent. They did that because the Ascent has a lower final drive ratio. That makes this feel peppier out on the road, and it gives you lower, more aggressive gearing for slightly tougher situations off-road like this. In addition to the lower final drive ratio, Subaru has also tweaked this transmission to deliver a bit more torque through the torque converter, something that some folks have complained about in the regular Outback model. Even though Subaru has not given us a tug-of-war to demonstrate that, it will really help out on 40-degree climbs like the one that I'm on here. This is a 40-degree climb section with some packed dirt, some rocks in here, etc., and you can tell that this definitely scrambles over everything pretty easily. One interesting thing about filming off-roads is that I'm climbing up this slope right now, and it is a lot trickier than you might think to get up on foot, but a capable all-wheel drive vehicle will do just fine. Because Subaru is not targeting the Bronco or the Wrangler with this model, they didn't give it locking differentials, front or rear. So this has essentially a very similar all-wheel drive system to the regular Outback with some software tweaks. So if you're looking for an SUV for serious boulder crawling, it's not going to be the Outback Wilderness. This just wasn't designed for that kind of duty in mind. But for most folks that are going to go out to a national park and drive on a road like this for even 20 or 30 miles or so to get to their favorite camping spot or their favorite mountain biking spot, this is going to be just fine. And that's why we have a revised X-Mode system. X-Mode is what Subaru calls their software package that manages torque and sends power around wheel to wheel. They've given this system the ability to operate at speeds higher than 25 miles an hour. Previous generations of the Outback turned the system off at around 25. Now that only applies to the deep snow and mud setting of the X-Mode system. If you're in snow and dirt, then it will still turn off over 25 miles an hour, and the software programming changes in deep snow and mud over 25 miles an hour as well. If you're transitioning from something that has a true locking rear differential or a limited slip rear differential mechanically, then keep in mind that the Outback Wilderness will still scrabble up the hills a little bit differently than some of those vehicles with true locking differentials. Because even though this all-wheel drive software has a predictive nature to it, in some situations, slip is still required for the vehicle to decide where to send power next. And of course, without a 2-speed transfer case, the system is never going to be able to send as much torque to the wheels as something like a Jeep Wrangler. But that's not Subaru's mission with the Outback Wilderness. The big reason for that is that Subaru wanted a vehicle that performed well in mild off-road situations like this, but also performed well on-road. They wanted that daily driver livability that you don't necessarily find in really rugged off-road vehicles. There are always going to be compromises. It's also important to remember that the Outback Wilderness is still the size of a regular Outback. So obviously, if you really wanted to tackle some of those extremely rough off-road situations, you're going to want a vehicle that is smaller than this, with a narrower wheelbase and shorter overhangs. But that's honestly not a huge segment of the off-roading population, and that's why, for instance, the 4-door Wrangler that is definitely less off-road capable in general terms than the 2-door Wrangler is by far the best seller in the Wrangler lineup. On the outside, the bulk of the Wilderness model is the same as the regular Outback model, but there are some key differences. We don't have any chrome trim on the side. We have these more aggressive fender flares. They're a little bit larger, and they stick out from the vehicle because the track has been altered. We also get a slightly tweaked front end, and you'll notice all these gold accents around the vehicle. The gold accents denote recovery points front and rear. We have more than you'll find in the regular Outback. The grille changes a little bit versus the regular model, and then down at the bottom of the bumper, right next to those recovery points, we have these really cool multi-module hexagonal fog lights. The increased ride height has the effect of improving the approach, breakover, and departure angles in the Outback, but remember, this is still going to be bigger on the outside than something like a RAV4. On the roof, we have some gold accent points. That's where you'll find roof tie-downs and a different roof rack arrangement than we find in the regular Outback. That's because Subaru said a common request for the Outback has been the ability to accept a roof tent. And apparently the base roof rack design was not made for that, but this one is. This one has a payload rating of 220 pounds while the vehicle is in motion and a stationary load capacity of about 700 pounds. That means that not only can you carry a roof tent, but you can sleep 2 adults inside. Moving to the rear, we find the same subtle tweaks that we find around the rest of the vehicle. A rear bumper that is all black plastic. That makes it a little bit more scratch resistant, or at least it won't show the scratches as much as a painted bumper. And you'll notice that we don't have the silver bumper plate right down there at the bottom that you find in the regular Outback model. Again, these gold accent points. There are 2 recovery points in the back rather than just 1. That gives you a little bit more of an option if you're off-roading, you get stuck, and you need to be pulled out to choose one side or the other. The Wilderness trim is more than just this eye-grabbing blue paint job, some skid plates underneath, and a new wheel and tire package. We also see some mechanical changes under the hood. The engine itself is the same as the other turbocharged Outback models. This is a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder turbo producing 260 horsepower, and you'll find this under the hood of not just the Outback, but also the Subaru Ascent, the larger Subaru 3-row crossover. And this is where the relationship between this and the Ascent is a little bit more interesting than this and the other versions of the Outback, because the CVT, this still has a continuously variable automatic transmission, has been essentially borrowed out of the Ascent rather than the rest of the Outback lineup. That gives this a lower final drive ratio than we find in the regular Outback, so more aggressive starting ratios essentially. This ends up somewhere around 17-1 rather than 14-1 in the regular Outback. And then they've also borrowed the rear differential ratios out of the larger Ascent as well. Subaru did this to give the Wilderness a bit more off-road capability than we find in the regular Outback model. We not only have more torque from this turbocharged engine than you find in the base Outback, but then it's further multiplied by that lower final drive ratio. The unfortunate hit there is fuel economy, because the ratios inside the continuously variable transmission are the same. That means that the ratio when you're out on the highway is not as high as the rest of the lineup, dropping the combined fuel economy score by 2 mpg. On the inside, there are a few tweaks versus the rest of the Outback lineup. Probably the first thing you'll notice is the black headliner, rather than the sort of light gray headliner that we find in the rest of the Outback lineup. According to Subaru, this should help hide marks from bicycle tires, hands, and of course other things that might mar your ceiling liner. The upholstery is one of Subaru's imitation leather products, and your eyes are not deceiving you, this is a 2-tone seat. So we have a slightly lighter section here, slightly darker section upper, and then lighter section in the middle. You can see the same sort of gold accent stitching here that you saw on the headrests. The outer portions of the upholstery have an embossed hexagon pattern on them. This mimics some of the hexagons that we see on the exterior. Other than the gold tag on the front doors, the rest of the front door styling is pretty much like the rest of the Outback lineup, but we do get some slightly tweaked styling right here around the door handles, slightly different trim there that continues onto the dashboard, where we also find more of that gold stitching that you saw on the seats. In the middle of the dashboard, we have Subaru's very large infotainment system. You'll find this screen in most of the Subaru Outback models out on the dealer lot, because only the base model gets a smaller LCD. This is one of the larger LCDs you'll find in a mainstream vehicle. It does support Apple smartphone integration, and that smartphone integration occupies a larger section of the screen than you find in most vehicles with a similar orientation screen like this. That's because Subaru is one of the only vehicle manufacturers to support Apple CarPlay in portrait orientation mode. We still have some physical buttons around there, and you can see the extra drive mode up here, X mode. We have snow and dirt, normal, and then deep snow and mud. Deep snow and mud will be active over 25 miles an hour in this version, and it allows more wheel slip than you'll find in the other drive modes. Rather than carpet floor mats being standard, we have rubber floor mats throughout the interior with a big Subaru Wilderness logo. Moving to the center console, we find 2 USB inputs for the infotainment system, a small storage area where you can keep your smartphone, electric parking brake, a button to activate the vehicle's camera system. Don't worry, I was able to fit some large smartphones in that storage cubby right there. We have a pretty traditional console shifter, obviously orange accents. There's a manual mode over to the left right down there behind drive. We have the same 2 large cup holders up front that we find in the rest of the Outback lineup, and a moderately sized 2-tier storage compartment. On the driver's side, we don't have any major changes. We just get some orange rings on the instrument cluster, and then of course orange accents on the steering wheel. Designing a new vehicle is all about finding the right balance. When you're designing a vehicle for off-road ability or on-road ability or a soft and supple ride or excellent handling, there are always going to be compromises with all of those design choices. And certainly by making this Outback Wilderness more off-road capable than the regular versions of the Outback, it has to give up a little bit in terms of on-road driving dynamics. That's just physics, because the weight is about an inch higher off the ground. We have different tires in this vehicle, and the different tires are definitely going to impact the way the vehicle feels out out on the road. The reality, of course, is that shoppers of all off-road vehicles, whether we're talking about something like this Outback Wilderness or the next step in off-road capability like the top-end versions of the Bronco or the Wrangler, most people still drive them to work every day, so they have to be daily driver livable. And Subaru has struck more of an on-road daily driver livable balance than honestly you'll find in something like the Wrangler Rubicon or the appropriate corollary in the new Bronco lineup. Because this vehicle does not have solid axles or locking differentials or a 2-speed transfer case or a rugged steel frame, the Outback is lighter and it's easier to drive. It handles better. It feels more like a regular passenger vehicle. This is definitely going to be an awful lot more fun to drive out on the regular road surfaces that you'll be commuting on most of the time, while still giving you a reasonable amount of off-road capability. Unfortunately, I don't have official 0 to 60 times yet. You'll have to wait until I get this at home. But in my quick rough test down here in Southern California, this appears to be about 0.2 of a second faster 0 to 60 than the regular Outback version. And it all has to do with the CVT's final drive ratio. This still has a CVT. It still imitates stepped automatic shifts. But because this has a lower, more aggressive starting gear, it definitely feels punchier off the line. On the other hand, because of the tire design on this vehicle, 60 to 0 stopping distances do appear to be a little bit longer. It took 5 feet longer for this to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. But again, keep in mind these are not official numbers, so they are subject to change once I get this at home and am able to test it on my usual test surface. In a logical world, the handling ability of the Outback Wilderness should fall behind the rest of the Outback lineup, but you'd be hard-pressed to tell the difference unless you have access to both of them on the exact same road surface and you're really pushing the vehicle hard. The difference is primarily in the tires, although again, the center of gravity does raise up just a little bit because of the added ground clearance. The other balancing act going on with the Wilderness is fuel economy. Because they gave this a lower final drive ratio, but we still have the same transmission ratios inside that we find in the regular Outback, the effect is that we have a lower starting ratio and a lower final ratio as well. So when you're out on the open highway, the engine is going to be turning a little bit faster than the regular Outback, and that means that highway fuel economy is, generally speaking, going to be a little bit lower. As with the regular Outback, one big win for the Wilderness is ride quality, whether we're out on a paved surface like this or the rougher off-road course that I was on earlier. That's because not only do we have more cushion in the tires than we find in most of the competition. For the Outback Wilderness, they went down to 17-inch wheels and tires with a taller aspect ratio that helps soak up some of those smaller imperfections out on the road a little bit better. But they've also given this more suspension travel in addition to the greater ground clearance. The more suspension travel you have, generally speaking, the better the suspension is at soaking up big bumps in the road, whether we're talking about speed bumps out on a paved surface like this, or moguls or ruts or ditches on off-road trails. That's one of the reasons we have really exaggerated suspension travel in vehicles like a Raptor or a TRX, although this is not playing to the same demographic that pulled a trick out of that same book to make this more comfortable in off-road situations. You'll really notice that if you're driving this back-to-back with something like the Honda Passport. The suspension in the Passport is relatively firm. It likely does not have the same kind of travel that we find in the Outback, even though it has a pretty decent amount of ground clearance. The Passport has a really capable all-wheel drive system, but I would much rather have this out on a really long trail because it's simply going to be more comfortable. I have to say I wasn't expecting the Outback Wilderness to be priced as aggressively it is. It starts at $38,120. You can get the extra skid plates from your dealer and either install them yourself or have the dealer install them at the time of purchase. If you do plan on taking your Wilderness out into the wilderness, I strongly suggest getting the extra skid plate package. It really makes this an interesting and unique option in this segment because not too many vehicles outside of really dedicated off-roaders like the upcoming Bronco or the Grand Cherokee or the Jeep Cherokee have this kind of skid plate protection. More interesting, however, is its price tag. At $38,000, this really isn't that much more expensive than something like a RAV TRD, and the RAV4 is considerably smaller than the Outback. It's also going to be less comfortable, have a smaller cargo area that's a little bit less practical, depending on exactly what you want to stick in it. The RAV4 does have a very square cargo area, but this one is a little bit longer and a little bit wider. But any way you slice it, the Outback Wilderness is going to be significantly less expensive than the more capable off-road vehicles that we find out there in the industry, like the Jeep Wrangler, the upcoming Ford Bronco, or something like a Jeep Cherokee Trailhawk if you check all of the option boxes, or the Grand Cherokee. The other thing to keep in mind is that even though fuel economy is a little bit lower in the Outback Wilderness, it is still significantly higher than anything out there with a 2-speed transfer case. Bottom line, the Outback Wilderness is the right vehicle for you if you want to go a little bit further off the beaten path, but you don't need the extra capability that you'd get out of locking differentials or a 2-speed transfer case, because those are simply not an option on the Outback. But you'd be surprised how far off the beaten path you can get with an all-wheel drive system like this and the increased ground clearance. It's also going to be a good option for people that are worried about adverse weather performance. If you live in an area where you're really concerned about ground clearance because of snow drifts, etc., the Outback is going to give you more ground clearance than you find in most of the competition with really good fuel economy. Be sure and let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below, and of course stay tuned because I will have a full and complete review of this with my usual handling numbers, official 0 to 60 numbers, 60 to 0 stopping numbers, all that sort of stuff coming up just as soon as possible. I'll see all of you later.